It is time for a new chapter, time to learn about a new subfield in psychology, and so now we're going to move on to talking about personality. And sometimes when people hear that word, personality, they'll think, oh, I didn't know psychologists study that. And maybe when you think of personality, you think of things like things that make people interesting. Like when someone is a fun person, we often say that person's got personality. Or maybe when you're talking about what you like about somebody, I just like them, they have a good personality. And maybe you've seen like personality quizzes online on social media or something like that. All right, so what is personality? Personality, your general definition, because there's a lot of specific ways to look at personality, but your general definition is an enduring and consistent style of thinking, feeling, and behaving in the world. All right, so enduring meaning long-lasting. Personality is not temporary. Enduring, persistent, it's who you are, essentially. Think about when we talked about developmental psychology, we talked about temperament. Temperament is like the early substrate, the foundations of personality. You're born with a particular temperament, or you have a particular temperament very early on, and then experience happens to you. And that experience does help to shape your personality, but your personality is ultimately stable. Most people have a very stable, persistent, long-lasting personality. It's their tendency to act, feel, think a certain way. All right, that's your very broad general definition. All right, the textbook that I'm using for class, it goes straight into talking about some major theories, some major perspectives in understanding personality. They go back to Freud and his psychodynamic theory. This is a little tricky when we cover this, because when we go over this, sometimes it's difficult to convey to students that just because we are going over something in class does not mean that it is correct. Because the one tricky thing about a lot of these perspectives on psychology, it's not necessarily like we are going to have one objectively correct view of personality. And Freud's notions are controversial, and that's a bit of an understatement. They also lack some scientific rigor in terms of how he came up with his ideas and how he maintained or verified or backed up his ideas. They do lack scientific rigor. He did not conduct scientific studies to support his ideas. It was sort of like an authority system of inquiry, sort of like, well, I'm the expert, I'm Dr. Freud, trust me, this is how things work. So there are some issues with Freud. So please understand that we go over Freud because he is historically influential. He was very influential on the field of psychology in general and on personality. He wasn't a psychologist, but he influenced the field for sure. So just keep that in mind. I want you to understand this stuff. I have heard, in my opinion, I would call them horror stories. I have heard horror stories of students who are like, oh yeah, my professor skipped Freud. I've never learned a thing about Freud. And I'm like, you need to know what he said, so that when we say, well, we don't really do that Freud stuff anymore, you need to know what we put aside and hopefully have an understanding of why. All right, so yes, you do have to learn about Freud, and there's going to be more than one video talking about Freud, because there's a lot. There's a good bit of relevant stuff that was very influential on early writing, early ideas, and influencing and inspiring further study in psychology. So what do we know about Freud? You may remember from the brief discussion of Freud previously, his general theory is known as psychoanalytic theory, and he developed psychoanalysis, which is really early form of what we would now generally call psychotherapy. So he was really a pioneer in therapy. Yes, let's give him credit for that. A lot of people do therapy differently than the way Freud originally proposed, but he got that started. That hey, we could help. We can do this talking cure thing and help people with their inner conflicts, their problems. And so with psychoanalysis, this is the theory and the treatment and the therapy. The theory and the treatment of personality developed by Sigmund Freud and it relies heavily. It relies heavily on a therapist interpreting a client's unconscious desires. And this is a key element of Freud's theories, is that we have these unconscious conflicts, these unconscious desires. What does unconscious mean? It's outside of your awareness. You don't have access to them. You cannot describe something that's in your unconscious. It can influence you, but you can't describe it. You can't recognize it. It's kind of hidden to you. Interesting idea, but that's a huge problem for science. For science, we have to be able to observe phenomenon. We have to be able to collect data, do measurements, observations. You can't do that if something's unconscious. So it's kind of like his stuff was set up so that you can't test it. Many people have criticized a lot of Freud's notions for being what we call non-falsifiable. You can't show they're wrong because you can't test them. That's not very scientific. With Freud, we have this idea of these unconscious drives influencing our behavior. We get this idea of psychic determinism. If you're familiar with that term determinism, maybe you've had it in a previous class. If your behavior is determined, that means it's controlled in some way. Your behavior is controlled as if you're a puppet. Well, who is the puppet master? Your unconscious forces. Those forces, those internal features that you don't have access to. They are outside of your awareness. So this is belief, typical in psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory, or the perspective, that unconscious processes underlie, they explain, all conscious thoughts and actions. All of the thoughts and actions that you do have access to, that you can describe, you can have a memory of, all of those are explained, all of those are controlled by this invisible puppet master that's in your unconscious. All right, a lot of people find this stuff interesting. It did influence a lot of literature and art, things like that, especially in the 20th century. But again, it's not testable. That is a huge problem. But we have to talk about it because a lot of stuff grew out of these ideas. He was popular and influential. Whenever you hear about psychoanalytic theory, you often, there's often a depiction of an iceberg. And there's even one in the textbook like this. And so you know an iceberg, big hunk of ice floating on the water, the thing that got the Titanic. The thing about an iceberg is most of it is submerged underwater. The part of an iceberg that you can see above the surface of the water is actually small compared to the entirety of the iceberg. Well, why is this relevant to psychoanalytic theory? Well, according to psychoanalytic theory, the part of the personality that you can experience, you can describe, it's in your conscious awareness. The part of the personality that's known to you is actually just the tip of the iceberg. The part of the personality that's below the surface, that is hidden, another term is latent, the part that you don't have access to is much bigger than the part you have access to, according to Freud. All right, in the next video, I'm going to talk more about Freud, and we're going to talk about the components of the personality according to Freud. He said it had 3 parts. We'll talk about them in the next video.